This November, Grand Rapids voters will decide if they want to limit how long the mayor and city commissioners can serve.
Term limits. It's been more than 20 years since you voted them in on a statewide basis.
24 Hour News 8 political reporter Rick Albin recently talked with one of the original supporters of the statewide term limit movement and a longtime legislator that have very different views on the impact of limitations.
There is no dispute that term limits have changed the way business is done in Lansing. There is, however, no unanimity about the value of that change. 6 years in the House, 8 in the Senate, then you're out. But is limiting the amount of time and thereby voters' choices a good thing or a bad thing? You make the call.
I think term limits has been a big success for Michigan.
The institutional memory has been destroyed.
Would you please stand and raise your right hand?
The impact of term limits, on one hand, is easy to assess. We know about the turnover or churn in the House and Senate. It's evident every 2 or, as in this election cycle, 4 years, when some members can no longer run. But beyond the calendar limitations, what else has changed?
And going on the floor, you and I, wasn't that many years ago, were there until 3 o'clock in the morning, night after night after night, because they just simply didn't have the capacity to really close a deal. Because there weren't any of those wise old sages who said, no, this is a problem, let's agree on the problem, and then let's agree on the solution. But I don't see a lot of that.
There are further amendments. The clerk will read.
Don Gilmer served 22 years in the State House starting in 1976. He left because he had to, because of term limits. But when he first arrived in Lansing, he had an advantage that today's freshmen do not, learning from members who had served in some cases for 2 decades.
And I could immediately go to those two and pick their brains. I mean, they were happy to do some mentoring. And now, you know, a mentor is somebody that's been there at least 2 years.
We were very clear about what it was.
Patrick Anderson from Anderson Economic Group was involved in the term limits movement from the beginning. His support of the idea has not wavered in the 2 decades plus since he pushed to have them implemented.
So this is part of our tradition to limit the amount of time that someone can be in a certain office to avoid the problems of concentration of power and of almost, you know, carrying it along in a monarchical sense onto someone else who you identify. That's been our tradition for a very long time.
Amendment is not adopted.
There's no argument that many new names and faces have emerged on the legislative scene since term limits were put in place. Anderson thinks that that's a good idea, even if he doesn't identify with all of those who have or are serving.
I think term limits has been a big success for Michigan. That's not to say that I like every elected official. That's not possible, right? Do I agree with every decision? Preposterous that anyone could do that. Do I see that some people do a better job than others? Of course. That's part of why we have term limits, because we want to have new ideas and we're going to accept that some people are going to disagree and do a better job than others.
Love them, hate them. Term limits are a way of life in Michigan state government, a way of life not likely to change anytime soon. Initially, Governor John Engler was a supporter of term limits. He, who had served 2 decades in the legislature, later 12 years as governor. But a couple of years ago, in an interview with the National Conference of State Legislators, Engler said, quoting here, "I don't think term limits have worked. I'm prepared to say it was a failed experiment," end quote. Despite his assessment and that of a number of current and former office holders, there is no reason to believe that there is any serious movement to change those limits. In part because lawmakers have no appetite for taking on what would surely be a controversial task, and in no small part, the perception that much of the public has of government in general, making a vote to repeal term limits unlikely. I'm Rick Albin, 24 Hour News 8.